How many of you read the book Longitude? Anybody? Few. All right, I'm going to tell that story in 2 or 3 minutes, just so people get it. Longitude's a fun little book, and it talks about what happened in the 18th century when the world was governed by sailing ships and trade. And basically, from time to time, an entire cargo on a sailing ship, a trading ship, would go down because they ran onto reefs and they crashed. And the reason they sank is because they didn't know where they were. And for hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years, sailors had known how to figure out latitude by looking at the stars. But they didn't know how to find where they were east to west on the face of the earth. They didn't know how to find longitude. And that's why they thought they were further west than they were, and they were somewhere else, and they sank. So the government, the Royal Geographical Society, I think, offered a prize of 50,000 pounds, which was real money in those days, to the scientist who could figure out a way that sailors could figure where they were on the face of the earth, east to west, and they offered the prize. And almost everybody said, well, the answer to latitude is in the stars. So the answer to longitude will also be in the stars. If we could figure out to look at the stars and take sightings and figure out where it is, there's got to be a way. We think so because that's how we figured out latitude. And they all went searching that way, except for John Harrison, who was a watchmaker, who said, I think the answer is not in the stars, it's in time. If the sailors knew what time it was in London, in Greenwich, and they knew what time it was there, they would know how far around 360 degrees they were from London. The problem was, back then, clocks had pendulums, and so they don't work well on sailing ships, and you couldn't take a clock that kept the time. And so, basically, he worked to develop a watch that would run on the ships, and he was right. If you had a watch that was set to London time, and then you took a sighting when the sun was over your head, wherever you were, you could figure out, oh, I'm this far around the world, now I know where I am on the map. So the good news is, he solved the problem, and that was the right answer to the problem, basically. But he only got half the prize, because all the scientists of the day said, no, wait, we've almost got it. We've almost got the star way of doing it. And they objected to giving him the prize because they were about to get it right. And so, but I tell this story just because I think it's a great story. It's a short book, it's fun to read, but because people get very embedded in the way they have done things in the past. And in my field of working in zoning and planning, one of the essential things is to get people to say, maybe it's time to think about this in a different way. It's not that the goals have changed. The goal was known. It's that we need to think a little bit differently about it and how we could get to that goal in a different way. Now let's see if I can find my clicker, which is somewhere around here. Has to be here, right? I better put it in my pocket. Do you have it back there? Nope. No. Well, let's see if I can find it. If I can find it, then we'll have a show. Otherwise, you can all go home. No, there we go. I got it. Thanks. Okay. So that's the value of change. Let me just talk a little bit. Jane gave me a very gracious introduction, but Clarion, my firm, this is what we do. We are a very small firm, actually. We love to be thought of as being giant, but we're small. But what we do is work with cities and counties around the country in zoning and planning. We do both zones and plans for communities, and we do zoning. I'm a planner by training, but I like to work on implementation. I think the world has got plenty of great plans out there. The problem is most of them just don't happen. And so zoning is one of the ways to make it happen. And we've worked all over the country doing this kind of stuff, which is a lot of fun. My kids think it's the most boring thing you could possibly do with your life. And I tell them when you're 55 and you think you're changing the future, it's pretty cool. I want to talk about 3 things tonight. One is planned communities in general. You are in the poster child for a planned community and one that turned out well in many ways. And Jane and I were driving around with Scott this afternoon, and I said, it's much easier to find stories of communities that were planned and turned out really badly. You are the exception. And so you don't want to lose sight of that. I want to talk about planned communities in general. There's an early drawing of Columbia. Then I want to kind of segue, because my theme is, I'm not an expert on Columbia. You are the experts on Columbia. But I do a lot of work around in different types of communities on what works in different contexts. So I'd like to talk about broad trends. When we draft new codes, and we do it with smaller communities, but we also do it with, we've written the Philadelphia Code and the Detroit Code and the Indianapolis Code. So we work in all kinds of communities, but the point is they usually get adopted if you run the process right. And what do we learn along the way? What do people decide to do differently than what they had before? And then I'd like to just talk generally about lessons from zoning life, kind of unintended consequences. What turns out to happen regardless of what you wrote. And so the idea is to provoke thoughts about what could be different and what would be different in ways that still got you to your goals. So first topic, planned communities in general. This is obviously a drawing from Brasilia. I don't know how many, anybody been in Brasilia? It looks like an airplane. That was what it was supposed to be in 1960. It's now sprawled way beyond the wings of the airplane, but it's turned out to be a fairly sterile place. They are trying hard to make it better, but there are a lot of mistakes to be made. Here's what I'd like to talk about. Planned community, and I'm going to draw some analogies to planned unit developments and master planned areas of communities as well as whole planned communities. A planned contract that says this is the way we're going to build this place is a great way to start a community, and you're an example of it, but it is often a difficult way to govern one. It takes a long time to negotiate, and renegotiating, when you negotiate, you lead to a picture of your preferred future. And on the day that you adopt it, it's at least acceptable to the property owner and to the government, or they wouldn't have done the deal. They thought it was wonderful. But that picture doesn't change over time. Now, I gather, and I think you should be proud of Columbia, that people are pretty happy with the picture that was drawn back in 1965. But the point is, things change. Owners change and they multiply. Ideas about what acceptable housing is changes. There are lots of creative, interesting ways for people to live, and that millennials want to live, and younger folks and smaller households that nobody thought of. Remember 1965? None of you were alive, but 1965, we thought it was all families with kids and station wagons, and that didn't turn out to be the future. Ideas about what you ought to be doing out of your home have changed a lot. We can talk about that if you'd like, but thanks to the internet and computers, people are doing things out of their home that no one knew would be possible to do out of their home with no impact on any of your neighbors. And then again, preferred modes of transport change. You have a great trail system, bike system, road system, but that preference for how people want to be able to get around has changed. Once again, zoning to a picture is not a problem on day one. It's a problem down the road because you're trying to achieve something that hasn't evolved. This picture here is, I was actually in the Palestinian territories a couple of months ago, and this is a new town called Rawabi. This is a model. This is the picture of Rawabi. It's on a hillside. It's built for 30,000 people. It's got an amphitheater. It's a gorgeous thing, but it's on the hills in the Middle East. And it's a picture, and they're building to it. I mean, this is my picture. That's their model. This is my picture looking up the road at the bottom row of housing that they've built here. Now, I will tell you, you know how many of these are occupied? 25. They're just starting. But here's my point. It's not that it's a bad idea. My point is, I have a hard time imagining how that's going to evolve over time. Somebody has an image of a place, and they have the money and the creativity to build that place. But as a zoning guy, I always ask, and what will happen when that needs to change? That's going to be really hard to change because it's built to a particular detailed picture. Most community pictures are static. They don't address what happens when it's outdated. And again, redevelopment. Remember, development of real estate is hard. Jim Rouse knew that, and he was very successful at doing it. Redevelopment is often harder. Putting things to a reuse turns out to be often more expensive and more difficult than the first job, which you thought was the hard one. So, and again, I hate to say this, but I'm gonna say what I think tonight, and you guys can yell at me later and throw things. Most of the time, redevelopment often requires an increase in density or a wider range of uses than you had before in order to generate revenues. You're replacing old infrastructure. You're replacing things that have worn out. That costs money. Where's the money going to come from? It's going to come from allowing wider things or more things or different kinds of things that the market now demands. And that's where you're going to get the money to retrofit what needs to be done. So, once again, one of the things that I run into all the time, there are no communities just like Columbia. You guys are really unique, not only in the design, but in the structure, the zoning, the covenants, the interweaving of the covenants and the law. I know I'm going to be asked, so where have you worked that's like Columbia? So I'll give you the answer now. There is no place like Columbia, so I haven't worked there. There are planned communities that have elements, and that's what I'm going to be talking from. You've got a lot of FDPs, framework development plans, and a unique mix of tools that made the place what it is. I get hired regularly by cities that were developed by planned framework development plans and master development plans to get them out of that. Because why? It's not that the picture was wrong, it's unadministrable over time. It is expensive to administer over time. This is a picture of Dublin, Ohio. This is the downtown, beautiful little historic town northeast of Columbus. Columbus is here. And so this is the Beltway, and this is a very wealthy community. People want to live here. The houses are very expensive. And they have a lot of corporate headquarters. This is the downtown. We were hired to work in this area to replan it as a walkable, urban, sustainable, bikeable. Literally, the corporations came and said, we used to hire the MBAs because they bought big houses with nice yards and station wagons, and now we can't hire them. They don't want to come here because it's not walkable and diverse and urban. Make us walkable, diverse, urban, and dense. Here, make it. And so we helped them do it. But in the process, I looked at their zoning map, and all this yellow is planned developments that are kind of structured a little bit like much of Columbia. There are master developments or general development plans, and then you have to do site-specific development plans. And I looked at that and I said, you and your staff must spend a lot of time amending PUDs because things need to be amended. And he said, that is all we do. We're hiring you to do this, the fun stuff, as an outsider, because all we do is try to amend and revise the contractual framework plans that were done earlier because they need to change over time. So again, they take time consuming. The original ordinance, the ordinance that set up the plan is rarely amended, the top level. But below that, you're often amending it. And the way planned communities work is that I can't change level 3 until I change level 2. I have to go back up and change something that was done before, which makes this a really time-consuming way to administer a city. Once again, a number of cities that we work in have asked us, I never get a community, I've worked in 2 communities out of the 50-ish that I've worked in that did not have a zone for planned development that could be negotiated, parallel in concept to the planning that went behind Columbia. If they don't have it, I tell them to get it. They need it. Everybody has things that need to be negotiated and planned. But 95% of the time, I'm hired by people who say, we have too many planned developments. It's driving us crazy. We need to move to straight zones. We need to move to zoning districts that will carry out this effect. Think about how it happens. When a planned community is under construction, you have brilliant planning. You hope you did. That's good. But you don't really know the order in which or what you're actually going to build. But after it's built, you do know that. Now the issue is, how do we govern that over time? How do we allow the right amount of change over time, or not allow very much change over time? But it's a different question. You don't need that much flexibility. People's tastes kind of change towards predictability, and they want to have kind of straight zones that are easier to do. I raise these. I will try not to use too many examples from Colorado, because in fact, very little of my work's in Colorado. But the examples I'm using tonight, I realize, call kind of disproportionately from it. The Centennial is a big city just incorporated a few years ago, 150,000 people in southeast of Denver. Lakewood is 200,000 people on the other side of Denver. This is Aurora. This is the third largest city in Colorado, 350,000 people, and that's the airport. Denver's over here. All 3 of these, Centennial and Lakewood and Thornton, Colorado, 3 suburbs in the last 10 years have said, we need to move from this expensive administrative mechanism of revising plans all the time to some zones. Draft new zones that will allow us to carry forward the intent of those areas without having to amend plans and higher level plans all the time. So those are just examples. Aurora, or I'm now working in Aurora to rewrite their codes, has said the same thing, and it didn't surprise me a bit. Get us out of the planned development business. And the whole, Aurora is an old city inside this old beltway, which is more like an older city. This is all between this highway and this highway is all planned development. So generation 1, they do typical zoning. Generation 2, everybody writes their own master plan, and then we make sure everything's consistent with it. Beyond the E470 beltway, and they own all this colored land, they've annexed all this colored land out here. All that area, they have said, we're not doing plan development out there anymore. We are going to apply straight zones because we can't run this system. It's too time consuming. So they have kind of moved through a series of things. And again, that's the older, that's the middle, sorry, I had these circles, that's the new. And Denver, where I do not do work because I sit on the planning board, is trying to get the money to do it too. Denver adopted a very innovative zoning ordinance about 5 years ago. It took them 5 years to write it. They adopted it. They rezoned the entire city that way, and it is one of the two most innovative zoning ordinances in the country. They had to learn an entirely new way of governing land use in order to implement the system, and I'm on the board watching it happen. But the interesting thing is they had to skip over about 700 planned developments embedded, little bitty Swiss cheese holes in the thing. And now they're trying to get the money to go back and fix that because they're trying to figure out now the planning director's current priority is how do I get back to the holes in the Swiss cheese and get that worked out. So the trend that I'm trying to explain is, in general, I get called to find ways to retain the vision of what we want to be now that we've grown up without the cost and expense and time of the way we did it when we built it. That is a major trend around the country. So again, and two of the nicest planned developments in Denver, because they've kind of gone through this, Stapleton is the old airport and Lowry is an old Air Force base. Interestingly, neither one of them, they were both heavily planned communities, but they ended up using zone districts. When you call Stapleton, I was sure the first time, you'd think I'd know this, but when I called up my friend Jim Chrisman and I said, did you do a planned development agreement with Denver to make Stapleton? He said, no, we used their standard zone districts. We just planned it very carefully and got them to write the right zone districts to carry out what we wanted to do. And Lowry did the same thing. So once again, I want to talk just a little bit about this issue. If it wasn't for the tension between flexibility and predictability, I could not earn a living, because this is what zoning is all about. Finding the right, that's an image from the book, very creative, I know. There's 100 years of tension in zoning between the desire for predictability and the need to introduce flexibility to do more innovation and to fit things onto the land better. And every time we make zoning more predictable, it becomes rigid, and we make changes to make it more flexible. And guess what? Every time we make it more flexible, we find a tool to come back and put more predictability into it. That's Don Elliott's zoning history in a nutshell. In general, and this is general, I realize that this may not be true in Columbia, planned communities were created to offer the developer a lot of flexibility as to how they built. Over time, they get more rigid. Why? Because people move in. The developer wanted flexibility, the citizens want predictability. They have different values. They moved in because they like it, now they want it to stay the same. And again, you add more quality standards and you add in more procedures to kind of make sure that things don't go sideways on you without you knowing that it happened. This is just a general statement. So my history of zoning, and this, I use this with my class basically, is, we started off with, 100 years ago, with zoning that was very flexible. All it said was, commercial here, housing there, industrial over there, 3-color map, we're done. And over time, through World War II, we evolved it into something very complicated. We added landscaping, we added parking, we added signage, we added stormwater. More and more rules, and it got rigid, which is why in the 50s and 60s we said, let's introduce some flexibility. Performance zoning says, let's let some of these rules out and just measure. Does it create noise? Does it create smoke? Does it create traffic? If not, okay, don't worry about it. And then we did planned development, and I'm using that as an analogy to the system of planned communities that Columbia was built under. That's the ultimate inflexibility for the builder. They can do what they need to do. And now the trajectory of zoning is headed back towards a little bit more predictability. How do you get, and we don't know. It's different communities say, we don't want to go back that much. Some people, Miami, I'd use it as an example, maybe Denver, have said, no, we want a lot more predictability into things. But that's the kind of general, the message I'm giving you is, there's no right answer. Every time we correct, we re-correct because you never get it right, and we use new tools to try to get it better than it was. So again, once again, large developments get developed over a long period of time. You have to be flexible. How do you work with a baseline of flexibility and still get enough predictability that you can attract residents and owners and builders and new buyers to do what you want, and you add steps to the process? Most planned communities, yours is more complicated than this, but most planned communities use at least a 3-stage process. And yours is simpler, but you've added steps to it. Rezoning, the original Jim Rouse would be the concept there in the Newtown zoning. Then you have to do FDPs to kind of lay it out, and then you have to lay out the individual site for the gas station, for the store, for the subdivision. That's generally that's how we've balanced it in the past. The problem is, when this turns out to be inconsistent with the overall look, you have to go back and forth, and sometimes you end up going back and forth a lot. And that's where the time and effort comes into the process. So again, when you try to introduce more predictability, you often wind up, here's what happens. You try to get more predictability of results. I don't want anybody to approve that without me knowing exactly what you're going to approve. Often results in less predictability in timing, i.e., if I want to tie down all the details, then we're going to spend more time negotiating them and more time amending what we approved before to lock in these details. So you gained knowledge that it won't turn out ugly, and you lost predictability in how long it's going to take or whether we can actually get this done. And unfortunately, the longer it takes to reach agreement on a picture, the greater the chance that the applicant's going to have to sell the property or the economy changes. So I will confess my bias, and I put it in the beginning of my book. I like efficient government. I want predictability, but I don't want the process to take so long that you end up killing good ideas because you bankrupt people or they run out. I have worked in communities, I hope this isn't one, where people like it long and complex because nothing ever happens without complete approval. I don't think that's a good way to run government. I don't think you wear out the other side, and a system that's based on wearing out whichever side you're on. If you're a big money developer and you think you can wear out the citizens and you like that system, or vice versa, I will tell you, I think you're wrong. That's not a good way to run a community. It ought to reach predictable decisions fairly efficiently. And I shouldn't put this up here probably, but this is your village center process, and it's complex. And I understand how it happens. I won't say that I've never drafted anything like that before, but it's complex. And I guess I want to point out there's a price to be paid for knowing exactly what's going to happen and knowing that it won't happen without you knowing exactly. There's a price to be paid. And there are questions to be asked as to whether it's worth that price. I like simpler systems. I would rather work on predictable rules and simple systems rather than flexible rules and complex systems. And there's some balancing there that has to happen. So that said, I want to get through this. I'll speed up a little bit and talk generally. That's kind of planned communities. But here are some broad trends, and I'll just have one or so slide on each one. This is the cover of the book that I did write. I enjoyed writing it. It's fun after you do something for 25 years. You think you know something that other people don't know, and so you write a book about it. These first 5 I'm going to tell you were out of the book. I stayed away from topics 6 or 7, sustainability and form-based approvals, because I thought I knew friends that were writing books and I didn't want to step on their feet. As it turned out, neither one of them wrote the book, so I'm going to get into those topics just a little bit. But flexible uses. I use this as a metaphor for codes that try to name everything that could possibly happen. Let me tell you something. The market can think up land uses faster than you can name them. And it's not a good use of time to try to name them all. It just isn't a good use of time. So in general, most of the codes that are written these days use fewer and broader categories of land uses. They try not to draw too detailed lines between different types of land uses. And these are the 4 areas. When you look at a code, often industrial uses, retail, and services are areas where most new codes get much, much simpler than they were before, because you don't need to be micromanaging this. This is a use table. Most communities have them. You name all the things you can do in your community. These are the zone districts of the community. And the trend is to have fewer rows. Even if you keep the columns the same, it's fewer rows because you talk about it more generally. The impacts of many of these uses on the community are exactly the same from a land use point of view. So you don't name them separately. And that's a pretty broad trend. We wrote the codes in Winnipeg several years ago. They named 460 uses. After we considered how many they needed, it was 140. Indianapolis went from 538 to 20. Miami gets 40. Washington, D.C. got down to about 30. And you're not far from Washington, D.C., but of course, they don't build cars or airplanes in Washington, D.C. They sit in offices. And so it's not that many things that you actually do in Washington, D.C. So it's a different situation. 2 is this mixed use middle. And this is typically in older codes, you get a listing that says these are the kind of houses we allow, these are the kind of apartments and townhouses. Here's some commercial, here's some, well, it might be churches and it might be colleges or schools, institutions. Here's industrial, and here are airport, landfill, weird stuff. We don't know what to do with it. And that is merging towards a much more simple. We have single family residents absolutely protected because everybody likes their neighborhoods. They want to have them protected. There are always weird things. But in the middle, this higher density multifamily through institutional, commercial, industrial, that is turning into a much simpler menu because despite our ability to name these separately, it turns out that much of it, they can be good neighbors and it doesn't matter. They can coexist. How do we know that? Because modern business parks have them coexisting and they are very successful. And so, again, most of the new codes we write are they have their residential stuff and mixed use stuff and special use. So the previous slide said, look, reduce the number of columns. This one says you could probably reduce the number of rows. Now, I'm talking generally. I'm not sure that's applicable to Columbia, but I'm not an expert on Columbia. It may not be applicable. Once again, these are just examples of how communities have tried to simplify it. Several years ago, we wrote the Philadelphia codes, which we were pleased. Eventually, they got adopted unanimously. But they went from 91 districts to 36 districts. And I tell people, if Philadelphia only needs 36 zone districts to govern a city that complex, you do not need. I'm also writing the codes for Brunswick, Maine, with 28,000 people, and they have 38. Saying, you don't need more than Philadelphia. I'm sorry, you're special, but you're not that special. So you're not more complex, I'm sorry. Again, and most of them don't distinguish, they just lump that stuff in the middle, and they allow the market the ability to transition that stuff. So, 3, getting more serious about attainable housing. Jane mentioned that inclusionary housing and attainable housing is a topic that you'll be dealing with in the future. This is a soapbox for me, and I'm not doing this because anybody told me to. I do this to everybody. I think that the problem in the US is very serious. It's a structural problem of our economy. The world economy is great at keeping wages low. It drives down wages, and housing costs are less subject to those forces. And so what's happened is, these figures are 2-3 years. They're worse today than they were. But again, average rate or income spent on housing has changed from 19 to 29%. HUD, by the way, US HUD says if you spend over 30% of your income on housing, you're stressing something else. Transportation, education, health, something's being shortcoming. Over half of America passes that threshold now. That's a serious problem. And again, the number is over 50% now. The real need, I hate to say, is in attached and multifamily units, and this is not a matter of the recession or the boom. This has nothing to do with it. This is a trend that has been happening since 1960. This is a structural problem. This is not an economic cycle problem. And to be honest, planners have sometimes made it worse because we do a lot of things that tend to drive up the cost of housing without really meaning to, but we do it. So there are lots of things. I just want to show some examples. These are just cities that we've worked in or used as reference where they've tried smaller lots. They've tried to figure out how this is a single family detached dwelling at a higher density. Things that share driveways and loops, lanes, co-housing. Santa Cruz is very interested. ADUs are secondary dwelling units on a property. They have pre-approved 8 templates. They hired an architect and said, we're not going to argue about each one of these things individually. There are 8 types that we think are acceptable in Santa Cruz. If you do one of these 8 types, you walk in and get a permit. So, and then Flagstaff's one of my favorite examples. They just hired somebody very bright to go in and lay out a whole variety of creative types of housing that you could do, and then put out here, meet these rules and build this kind of housing. It's not a hearing. It's not something that you need to have a political battle over. It is something you may do. We call this a house. If you build it this way, it's a house. If you don't build it this way, you're going to need a variance or you're going to get a public process. But the third topic here is I urge you not to ignore this process. There's so much wisdom behind the idea of Columbia. And at that point, the challenge of attainable housing wasn't nearly what it is today. But if you're not thinking about attainable housing as a planner, you guys are all forgiven, but the planners are not. You're not doing your job. It's a serious problem. If we're not building communities for the people who need to live there or want to live there, then there's something fundamentally wrong about your thinking. Sorry about that. You tailor different standards to mature areas. Columbia was developed as a greenfield area, and I run into lots of cities where the freshest thinking and the newest ideas are always done on the edge of the city. That's where it grew. That's where we got the new idea. That's where we put our smartest planners to figure it out. And they did it. And then the city tries to apply them back in older areas. And old, mature areas of cities need different solutions than the greenfield areas. You need to be more flexible if you really want it to develop. And you need to remember, it's kind of funny, ironically, the sustainability movement has contributed to this, because all of a sudden we have more people saying, why can't we find a reuse for that building? Why can't we be more flexible about the standards? Because we need to get somebody in that building. And again, even though planned communities are kind of the poster child for why good design is important, and in this case, they set up a good management structure. That's why you all enjoy living here. But as cities age, the fabric, the framework is there. There's less need for individual design thinking and a whole lot for how do we use and reuse effectively the things that have already been built and encourage replacement. So I just use these slides to say cities increasingly find a need as they mature and densify to find different ways of buffering, different ways of screening, different ways of getting green space in. Fifth trend is to involve citizens earlier in the process. I'm speaking broadly nationally. To involve citizens early in the process and not in a beauty contest on every project that comes through. I know Howard County has pre-application meetings and community meetings. That trend is continuing. Most cities they want better discussions between a redeveloper and the citizens earlier in the process before they've spent the money to design something. Once they've spent the money to do nice architectural and engineering renderings, they're going to be very resistant to change their ideas, and you can't blame them because they paid the engineer once and they don't want to pay him again. So the only realistic solution to that is to require those kind of conversations earlier in before the process is done. Why? And again, and then I say call up some bump ups. It would rather have those discussions earlier and have those things at a lower point in the process, and then have fewer public hearings late in the process. I don't know to what degree you do this, but I'm speaking generally about trends. Most cities are trying to delegate more authority to staff to make decisions. Why? Because it's faster, it's more efficient, and it's more predictable. And it really is. This is a funny thing about my profession. In some communities, there's a big distrust about planners, and yet planners make good decisions the vast majority of the time. And when I help a community delegate, well, our planning commission has always done this, but Don says we ought to let staff do this and have better criteria. We do that. Somebody will say, Don, I need a right to appeal it. Trust me, in our community, everybody will appeal every decision. They don't trust staff. You know what happens? They don't appeal every decision. You have a very low appeal rate because, wonder of wonders, if you draft the code right and the criteria are strict and the criteria are clear, the planners make pretty good decisions, and people are not dissatisfied with those decisions. So anyway, use non-political groups for hearing officers. You're already doing that here, I guess. And this is my impact of soapbox and an X through it. Very creative. It's bad public policy to set rules for people who are investing in redevelopment of a mature community, and then set the stage for people to come in very late in the process and try to undermine somebody who's actually followed the rules. If that's your problem, rewrite the rules so they do it right. I'm serious. We learned this in kindergarten. You don't change the rules when the game is underway. You write the rules and you play the game by the rules. If you get results you don't like, then you go play a different game and you write different rules. But you try not to do it, and this is a major trend around the country, partly because it's efficient, but also partly because I really don't know any community that doesn't want economic development, that doesn't want the older stuff to be replaced by newer stuff, either newer stores or commerce or industry or businesses. You need blood flowing through the system. Now, Aspen doesn't, but you can name on the fingers of a couple of hands the places that put up a stay out, we don't want you sign. Most places, big places, need stuff going through. And their business community is telling us, you want us to come in, then tell us the rules and let us do it. And frankly, I've heard many developers say, I don't care what the rules are, as long as you apply them and then apply them to my competitor the same way you apply them to me. but you do it that you don't set up a system where I follow the rules and there are still abilities to pull the rug out from under me after I spend all this money. That, if you want to know why I'm not developing in your community, that is why. It's not because you ask for too many trees and bushes. It is because of the unpredictability in the system. So this is a major trend. I do want to talk a little bit about sustainability, just 2 slides. When you talk about sustainability, it's a very popular topic these days. You wander off into all of these things. And here's my mantra. Trying to say something, everything in planning and quality of life can fit under the umbrella of sustainability if you try. It's a very big umbrella. The more you broaden the umbrella, the less you can say about anything that actually can guide public policy, because you're trying to talk about too many things. And so, when I work with communities on sustainability, here are the 5 topics. My principle is, if you're talking zoning, then focus on the types of sustainability that zoning can make a difference in. And I'll just say this, somebody will always say, well, Don, doesn't sustainability start with a job? If my son can't get a job in this community, he can't live there. That's true, but if you mix your job and housing talking with sustainability, I think you've just watered it down to the point where it's very hard to say anything about environmental sustainability. So yes, these are important. Yes, every county has programs to get obtainable housing and job creation. That, in my world, it is not helpful to put that under the umbrella of sustainability. It is best to keep them separate. But these are the 5 things that come out. Yes, zoning can reduce greenhouse gases. Yes, it can promote energy conservation, renewable energy, and local food production, and walkability, connectivity, water conservation. If I go out west, if I go into the arid west like Denver, water conservation moves up to about number 3. But in the east, it rains a lot, so you guys don't put as high a priority on it. But the point is, it turns out that these 5, there is a sort of a 6th. The 6th would be trash and recycling. Those are if you keep your discussion to those things, you can actually write zoning that does improve the situation. If you wander off into everything for everybody, it's likely that you're not going to do much about it. Finally, form-based zoning. I just wanted to say this because we've talked, I also co-authored a book on the rules that shape urban form. In 2 sentences or so, form-based zoning says, we are going to have much stricter rules about the look and the feel of this building and how it relates to the street and where the parking is and whether it's got windows and doors on the street. We're not really saying it has to be a style, but we care, we're going to ramp up the detail of what we do that talks about the form and the shape and the appearance and the location of the building, and then we're going to get really flexible about what you can do with it. Because it's not about land use controls, it's about building form and how they fit into the fabric. So this is a major trend over the last 25 years in zoning. It's based on this transect that says, look, know what, are you rural, are you agricultural, are you suburban, are you an urban center, are you a bigger urban center, are you downtown? And if you really have drunk the Kool-Aid on form-based zoning, you say, you start by knowing what you're doing. Are we writing rules for this or here? Because they're different and they need different rules. And this image has become highly influential in urban planning as an image of know what kind of a place you're planning for and get it right. Most activity is in these urban areas. If you go around the country and say, where did you apply this? The answer is in our village centers, in our town centers, in our downtown, in our transit centers. Well, didn't you apply it in the suburban single-family areas or the urban single-family areas? Not so much. We know how to do nice neighborhoods. It's this stuff that wasn't walkable and sustainable. So here's an image. I'll just walk through it quickly. Often it involves defining conceptually a building and saying what kind of a building it is. It can be a storefront or a stoop or cottage. This image is from one code we wrote. The table's from another. That's why they don't line up. But they define 6 types of buildings. And instead of saying store, housing, apartment, they don't list uses. They list types of buildings. And here are the districts. And these are used downtown, Main Street or downtown districts. And instead of telling them what you can do in the building, they do have regulations, but they're very general. They say, this kind of building is okay here, but it's not okay here. How do we know that? We studied the fabric of the area. We don't want that kind of a building here. We don't want that kind of a building here. So this is an image of how it's to convey what form-based zoning does. It governs by building type rather than focusing on land uses. Here are images. There are typologies of how buildings face the street, typologies of how you do open space that are urban and walkable and sustainable. And there is a map. And instead of this map saying industrial, housing, apartments, it says building type 1, building type 3, building type 5. You're governing, and it looks like a zoning map, but it's talking about the fabric of the place and not so much about land uses. Here's what we studied. The 6 pillars, if you talk to the Form-Based Zoning Institute, How do you know that you're doing this new kind of zoning correctly? Well, you know it when you say we have these things: building types, frontage types, public spaces, block and subdivision standards. And we studied 6 cities across the US and said, so if that's 6 cities that said they had form-based zoning, and here's what we found. They pick and choose. That's my message. Pick and choose the ones that work for your community. To me, that is no surprise. I work with local governments all the time. That's how I make my living. Local government usually picks the tools that work, and they leave the tools that don't work. There are not very many that say, I'm adopting this tool because it's theoretically correct. They choose the things they need, they choose the things they don't need, and they leave the things they don't need. The blue circles are, yes, Mooresville, North Carolina, used building types. Austin, a little bit. Denver, not at all. Miami, a little bit. What about public space, defining an urban public space? Well, 3 out of 6. What about these types of walkable blocks? 2 out of 6. So my only point is I'm trying to hit major trends. There is a trend to think about using form-based tools. To the degree counties and cities use them, they are selective, and they choose the parts that they think work, and they leave the rest of it alone. All right, last part of this, and it's this is kind of what you learn. What's the what? What happens out there? Not in terms of trends, but what are the lessons you learn over time? It's okay to fix your zoning before you fix your plan. I went to planning school, of course, and in theory, you always write a plan, and then you write the zoning to implement the plan. 50% of our clients say, I have no political will to replan the neighborhoods or the city, but I have political will to rewrite the zoning ordinance because it is screwed up, because it is really creating unintended consequences. So again, I expect that if you guys pursue a discussion about trends in zoning and what to do with Newtown, the question is, shouldn't we adopt a new plan? Don't you plan before you zone? And my answer is, well, half do and half don't. Philadelphia was an interesting thing where they said we're going to do zoning because we have no. They had a public referendum. Do you agree the zoning ordinance is so screwed up we ought to fix it? 2-to-1 vote, yes, fix the zoning. They did not try to fix the plan. Philadelphia didn't even have a comprehensive plan. Hadn't had one since the 70s. But after they got involved in zoning, they said, okay, now we're going to fix the zoning. Now we're developing the political will, and they springboarded that into, okay, then we ought to rethink our plan too. But this is one of the lessons. Redevelopment is very different than raw land development. I think I've made that case. It should be easier because the context is easier. You're not making it up. You know what fits. How do you know? Because what's around it is now a known thing. So you do this, but most codes make it harder. You've got more neighbors, you've got more people interested, and they over-focus on details that, frankly, don't make much difference to the future of whether that's going to work well or be loved by people 10 years down the road. This is just my comments. Often, we make it much harder to approve a redevelopment than we did the new development. Kind of natural, more neighbors, more concerns, but in zoning, you want to make it easy to do what you want people to do and hard to do what you don't want them to do. And we make it harder to do often what we want them to do, which is redevelop and reinvest. Good redevelopment is about ensuring contextual quality and reducing risks. You can get good contextual quality without a beauty contest. It's just true. You don't have to review every building. An increasing number of cities write development standards that get them the degree of quality they want in buildings without having it reviewed individually each time. And risk is the key issue. If you really want redevelopment, you reduce the risk. How do you reduce risk? You reduce the unpredictability and the number of steps in the process. And you get the public involvement where it makes the most difference, which is early rather than at the time the guy spent all the money. Don't overregulate the design. You'll be constantly amending them. A little unpredictability can be good for diversity. It's a hard discussion to have because Columbia was developed with deliberate amounts of variety and diversity in it. But most mature cities have to live with a little bit of unpredictable diversity. That's what makes them interesting places as they mature. And that'll be a discussion that you have if you move forward. This is a plan that I did not draw, but this is for Dublin, Ohio. There's the outline. And when they said, make us walkable and urban and dense and funky, this is what a design firm drew. Let me tell you. And then they said, Don, write a code to make that happen. And I said, I will not write that, because the one thing I know today is that it ain't going to happen, is that you will be constantly amending this. This is an idea. You need codes that draft what parts of this are important. Is this location of this building important? No, it actually isn't. There are lots of, the fact that that building will come up to the street and be walkable and it'll be between 3 and 5 stories tall or 2 and 3 stories tall, that's important. The fact that they lay out exactly like this, if you owned the property, go ahead. But you don't. There are about 217 property owners in here. And they don't wake up singing Kumbaya. They do not agree with each other as to what would happen. So we just said, we're going to have to make it much more general. And you know what? It'll turn out okay. Because you're not painting a picture here. You're setting rules for investment and redevelopment. In fact, I think this is my last slide. Not every little P place is a big P place. I get the sense you've had that discussion here because of the concern about village centers and downtown and other places. But I guess one of the issues I have with Denver's code, which applies building types and a form over 100 square miles, is that there are places that are kind of background that don't need individual design control because they're not the focal places that people go to and form their image of the community and spend time in. They're kind of background places. Union Station, our train station, is a brilliant redevelopment project. I had nothing to do with it, but it's a brilliant, and that's a place. An average block of multifamily housing, if you have good quality standards for it, I hope I'm not offending anybody, is not a place. It is a background. If the building fits in and complements what's around it, a lot of different buildings would do just fine in that location. And you don't need to be approving the details of everything about this. There's a difference between those things. As usual, I've taken way longer than I thought. So I apologize for running a little bit longer than I thought, but I hope it's been thought-provoking. I hope people object, but don't throw anything, okay? So,